The bitter winds howl through the ancient pines as John Everett faces the most brutal winter the mountains have seen in decades. At 2:32 dew-tribe scene, his breath freezes before his eyes. With only an axe, dwindling supplies, and the small fire he struggles to keep alive, John's real battle isn't just against nature's fury. It's against the creeping doubt that whispers impossible odds with every gust of wind. His weathered hands, cracked and bleeding, work methodically. Each spark from his fire represents something more than heat. It's hope, crystallized in the darkest night. But as the temperature continues to drop and wolves circle his small camp, will his lifelong wilderness skills be enough? John's fingers trace the worn edges of his leather journal, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from years in the wilderness. The firelight flickered across entries dating back 15 years, meticulous notes on weather patterns, wildlife behavior, medicinal plants, and personal reflections that charted not just his survival knowledge, but his journey into solitude. Third dry summer in 10 years, he muttered, reviewing patterns that had preceded harsh winters. Should have seen this coming. The cabin creaked around him, a sturdy structure he'd built with his own hands, after leaving behind a life that no longer made sense. 20 years as a forest ranger had taught him the mountains' language, but only living alone among them had made him fluent. Wind rattled the shutters as he closed the journal and moved to check his stores. The root cellar revealed rows of preserved vegetables, dried meat, and canned goods. Enough for a normal winter, but something in his bones told him this one would be different. John had learned to trust those feelings. They'd kept him alive when scientific forecasts fell short. At 62, his body protested more than it used to. The ache in his right knee foretold storms better than any barometer. Still, his hands remained strong, calloused from constant work, and his eyes sharp enough to track game through dense forest. Morning brought crystalline air and a silence that spoke volumes. John stood on his porch, coffee steam rising like prayers before him. The thermometer already showed -15, unusually cold for this early in the season. The valley below, normally visible from his elevated perch, had disappeared beneath a blanket of fog. Above, heavy clouds promised more snow. Going to be a long one, he said to no one. His routine never varied. Check traps, gather firewood, maintain equipment, scan horizons for weather changes. Today he added reinforcing the north wall where last winter's storms had tested the log's integrity. Each task performed with deliberate care, as if the quality of his work directly negotiated terms with winter's harshness. The radio crackled intermittently with forecasts from the nearest town, 80 miles downriver. Unprecedented cold front approaching from the Arctic, the staticky voice warned. All residents in mountainous regions advised to evacuate to lower elevations until further notice. John smiled grimly. He'd heard similar warnings before, though not with such urgency. Evacuation had never been his way. The mountains had called him when civilization became unbearable after Sarah's passing. They had sheltered him when grief threatened to hollow him completely. He wouldn't abandon them at the first sign of difficulty. His evening check revealed the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. The pines groaned under accumulating ice, their boughs drooping like mourners at a funeral. John added another log to the fire and pulled out his journal again, recording observations with the diligence of a scientist and the reverence of a disciple. A wolf's howl echoed through the valley, closer than usual. John recognized the timber wolf's voice, having catalogued the local pack's movements for years. They normally avoided his cabin, but extreme weather changed behaviors. He made a note to secure the livestock shed more thoroughly tomorrow. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by dreams of Sarah and the daughter who'd stopped speaking to him long before he'd retreated to the wilderness. In his dreams, they stood in his cabin, looking around with disapproval, asking why he'd chosen isolation over family. He woke before dawn to a world transformed. 8 inches of fresh snow blanketed everything, with more falling so heavily he could barely see the woodpile. 20 yards away, The thermometer had stopped working, the liquid frozen solid inside the glass tube. John stroked his beard, ice crystals already forming in the coarse grey hair from his breath. He'd need to bring more firewood inside today, perhaps all of it. The journal had warned him, patterns from years when blizzards lasted weeks, when temperatures dropped low enough to freeze sap in trees. The mountains were speaking, and John Everett listened. He'd survived here by respecting nature's power, by bending to its will while maintaining enough resistance not to break. But as he stepped back inside to prepare, that small voice of doubt whispered from a corner of his mind. Was this the winter that would finally prove too much? The gold band on John's left hand caught the firelight as he stoked the flames. 15 years since Sarah's passing, yet he'd never considered removing it. The simple ring had weathered alongside him, scratched by the same work that had scarred his hands, dulled by the same elements that had weathered his face. "Going to be a cold one tonight, old girl," he whispered, a habit he'd never broken. Sometimes he swore he could hear her laugh in the crackling of the fire. John rubbed his thumb across the band, remembering their 30th anniversary had been 3 weeks before the diagnosis. Terminal, the doctors had said, 6 months at most. Sarah had lasted 4. The wind outside howled like a wounded animal, pulling him back to the present. He moved to the window, frost patterns already claiming the edges of the glass. The storm was intensifying faster than forecasted. Even the wildlife had gone silent, a bad sign. His gaze drifted to the small table beside his bed, where a faded photograph sat in a hand-carved frame. Rebecca, at 18. High school graduation, the last image he had of his daughter. She'd be 37 now, perhaps with children of her own. Grandchildren he'd never meet. "You were right, Sarah," he muttered. "I should have tried harder with her." The argument after the funeral had been the final break. Rebecca couldn't understand why he'd retreat further into his ranger duties rather than grieve together. By the time he realized his mistake, she'd moved across the country, changing her number, making it clear she wanted no contact. A particularly violent gust rattled the entire cabin, forcing John's attention back to immediate concerns. The radio, his tenuous connection to the outside world, crackled with static. Expected to be the worst cold front in 30 years, the transmission cut in and out, temperatures dropping to -22°C or below. More static. Last supply helicopters, grounded until further notice. John frowned. The monthly supply drop wasn't due for another week, but it contained his medication, nothing life-threatening, just blood pressure pills. He'd have to ration what he had left. Moving to his desk, John pulled out his topographical maps, studying potential emergency routes. If things got truly desperate, there was a ranger station 26 miles southeast. In good conditions, he could make it in 2 days. In this weather, it might be suicide to try. A sharp crack outside startled him. John grabbed his rifle and flashlight, stepping cautiously onto the porch. The beam cut through swirling snow, revealing a massive pine branch that had snapped under the weight of accumulating ice, narrowly missing his woodshed. That was close, he breathed, surveying for other dangers. The thermometer now read -18, still dropping. John reinforced the woodshed door with extra rope, knowing that losing his fuel supply would be a death sentence. His breath formed clouds that crystallized almost instantly in the frigid air. Back inside, he methodically checked his emergency supplies. The satellite phone hadn't worked in years, damaged in a previous storm and impossible to replace this far out. The emergency radio transmitter had better range than his weather radio, but required power from the solar batteries, which would struggle under heavy snow cover. John's ranger training kicked in as he performed a thorough inventory. 6 weeks of food at normal consumption, stretching to 8 if rationed carefully. Medication for 17 days. Kerosene for the backup lamp, enough for a month of minimal use. Ammunition sufficient for hunting, though game would be scarce in these conditions. As he worked, memories flooded back. His first winter training with the Forest Service. Sarah's worried face when he'd embark on rescue missions during storms. Rebecca's childhood delight at his wilderness stories. Before everything changed, the last supply delivery had been 3 weeks ago. Mike, the young pilot, had seemed concerned even then. "Climate guys are saying this might be historic, John," he'd warned while unloading supplies. "Maybe think about coming back with me. Just until spring." John had laughed it off. "These mountains and I have an understanding," he'd said. "Been through worse." Now, watching ice form on the inside of his windows despite the fire's efforts, he wondered if he'd been too confident. The gold band felt suddenly heavy on his finger, a reminder of everything he'd lost, everything he'd walked away from. For the first time in years, John questioned his choice of solitude. Not from fear, he'd faced death before, but from the sudden, acute awareness of how completely alone he truly was. John spread the topographical map across his table, its creases and folds telling stories of countless expeditions. Faded pencil marks dotted the terrain, X's indicating natural shelters, circles marking water sources, triangles warning of dangerous passes. 15 years of hard-earned knowledge traced onto paper. "Not good," he murmured, studying the weather patterns moving across his position. His finger traced the ridgeline separating his cabin from the nearest evacuation route. Already impassable now, he suspected. The storm had intensified overnight. Snow accumulated faster than John had seen in years, already reaching the bottom of his windows. The wind found every crack in the cabin's construction, whistling through like unwelcome guests. But most concerning was the temperature. The backup thermometer showed -20 now, with the barometric pressure still falling. A thunderous crack shook the cabin. John grabbed his coat and rushed outside to find the massive spruce that had stood sentinel beside his home for decades now, sprawled across his roof, branches piercing the shingles. Snow poured through the new opening, already accumulating on his bedroom floor. "Damn it all," he growled, assessing the damage. The tree had missed the main support beams, but the breach would make heating impossible. Already the howling wind was carrying snow inside, temperature dropping noticeably. John worked methodically, despite numbing cold. First, clearing broken branches for access. Next, covering the hole with the tarp he'd used for his wood pile. Not a permanent solution, but it would buy time. His breath formed ice crystals in his beard as sweat froze against his skin. By midday, he'd managed to seal the worst of the damage, but the bedroom remained unusable. The main living area would have to serve all purposes now. John consolidated essential supplies, building a mental inventory of what could be sacrificed if necessary. He powered up the emergency radio, conserving the precious battery. Static crackled before a voice broke through. Worst blizzard in recorded history for the northern ranges. The transmission faded in and out. Confirmed temperatures of -22°C in lower elevations, substantially colder at higher altitudes. More static, all rescue operations suspended until conditions improve. John switched it off, conserving power. The message was clear. He was entirely on his own. The map caught his attention again. His eyes traced the contour lines, seeking options. The emergency cabin near White Pine Ridge might be reachable, 3 miles northeast, but relatively sheltered from the worst winds. He'd stocked it with basic supplies in the fall. A long wolf howl penetrated the cabin walls, followed by answering calls. The pack was moving, likely struggling to hunt in these conditions. John had observed their behavior for years, noting how extreme weather pushed them to take greater risks, venture closer to human dwellings. The roof groaned under accumulating snow. John knew he'd need to clear it soon or risk another collapse. But exhaustion pulled at him like gravity. His hands, despite thick gloves, had lost sensation during repairs, warning signs of frostbite. He built up the fire, positioning himself to warm his extremities gradually. As feeling painfully returned, John reviewed his situation with ranger's objectivity. The cabin was compromised, but still functional, food supplies sufficient if managed carefully. The greatest immediate threats: structural failure from snow load, hypothermia if the fire couldn't be maintained, and wildlife growing desperate with hunger. The map offered cold comfort. Knowledge of terrain was useful only if you could navigate it. With visibility reduced to mere feet and temperatures deadly after minutes of exposure, venturing out became a calculated risk rather than a certain escape. Night fell early, darkness absolute beneath the storm clouds. John positioned his chair facing the door, rifle within reach. The wolf calls had grown closer, more frequent. Their hunting grounds would be barren, their desperation mounting alongside his own. He traced the worn paths on his map one last time before folding it carefully. Tomorrow would require clearing snow, reinforcing the roof, and checking his perimeter for predator signs. Each task exponentially more difficult in these conditions, each failure potentially fatal. The cabin creaked and settled around him, its familiar sounds now carrying new menace. John closed his eyes briefly, summoning Sarah's face in his mind. In the darkest moments of past winters, that image had sustained him, her quiet confidence in his abilities, her practical wisdom. One problem at a time, she would have said. Just solve what's in front of you. Outside, the temperature continued its merciless descent, and something large moved through the darkness, circling ever closer to the fading warmth of his compromised shelter. The radio sputtered and died with a final burst of static, leaving only the sound of wind and John's measured breathing. He turned the unit over in his weathered hands, examining it for obvious faults. The ancient device had been his faithful companion for a decade, broadcasting weather alerts, occasional news and rare emergency communications from the ranger station. Now, when he needed it most, it had failed. John tried the backup batteries, wiggled connections, and tapped the casings, tricks that had resurrected it in the past. Nothing. The red indicator light remained stubbornly dark. His tenuous connection to the outside world was severed. Perfect timing, he muttered, placing the radio carefully on his workbench. He'd try dismantling it later, though electronics had never been his strength. The morning had brought no relief. Snow continued falling in thick, relentless sheets. John had awakened to find drifts reaching the windowsills, the world outside transformed into a blank white canvas. The thermometer registered -22 now, the coldest he'd recorded since moving to the mountains. His breath hung visible in the cabin despite the fire's efforts. Ice formed on the inside of windows, delicate crystalline structures that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. The damaged roof section, despite his repairs, allowed cold to infiltrate like an invisible predator. John inventoried his supplies with military precision. The news was sobering. With normal consumption, food would last approximately 40 days. Firewood, if carefully rationed, perhaps 30. Medication 17 days at regular dosage. The solar batteries were already struggling under heavy cloud cover, providing barely enough power for essential light. He'd faced isolation before, weathered fierce storms and sub-zero temperatures, but something about this felt different. A primordial warning in his bones that transcended weather forecasts or survival calculations. The wolves had fallen silent since dawn, an unnatural quiet that concerned him more than their howling. Silent hunters were hunting. John checked his rifle, counting ammunition methodically. 27 rounds total, more than enough for defense, but hunting would deplete it quickly. Movement at the window drew his attention. A raven perched on the sill, regarding him with unsettling intelligence. In his years of wilderness living, John had developed a healthy respect for these birds, their problem-solving abilities, their adaptability. The raven cocked its head, studying him for long moments before launching back into the swirling snow. John found himself unsettled by the encounter. His grandmother, half Cree, would have called it an omen. He'd inherited her pragmatism, but also her tendency to read meaning in nature's patterns. The day passed in essential tasks, reinforcing his roof patch, melting snow for drinking water, reorganizing supplies for maximum efficiency, each movement deliberate, conserving energy in the increasingly frigid air. By late afternoon, John faced a critical decision. His main cabin was compromised, rapidly losing heat, despite his best efforts. The small emergency shelter he'd constructed 50 yards downslope might prove more defensible against the cold, its lower profile and smaller space, requiring less fuel to heat. Moving meant exposing himself to the deadly temperatures, but staying might prove equally dangerous as night approached. He packed methodically, essential supplies only, extra layers, emergency rations, first aid kit, fire-starting materials, the map, his journal, the broken radio, on the slim chance he could repair it. Each item evaluated against its weight and survival value. The wedding ring remained on his finger, its familiar weight, a connection to something beyond immediate survival. Stepping outside was like plunging into ice water. The cold attacked exposed skin with predatory efficiency, burning his lungs with each breath. Visibility extended barely 10 feet, the world beyond existing only in memory and imagination. John used the guide rope he'd installed between structures, moving with painful slowness through snow, reaching mid-thigh. Each step required careful calculation. Too fast meant sweat, which would freeze almost instantly against his skin. Too slow meant prolonged exposure. The emergency shelter appeared through the whiteout, a low, dark rectangle against endless white. John's fingers, despite heavy gloves, had lost sensation by the time he reached the door. The simple padlock required 3 attempts, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Inside, the temperature was marginally better, still well below freezing, but sheltered from the wind that multiplied cold's effects. John worked quickly to start a fire in the small stove, movements hampered by numbed extremities. Each minute without heat increased danger exponentially. When flames finally caught, the relief was momentary. John surveyed his new accommodation with a ranger's objectivity. Smaller meant easier to heat, but more confined. Lower ceiling height conserved warmth, but limited movement. No windows meant security, but also darkness and isolation, even more absolute than before. A sensation returned painfully to his extremities. John placed the broken radio on the small table. Its silent presence mocked him, the embodiment of his complete isolation in the face of what was rapidly becoming not just a storm, but a battle for survival against the most implacable enemy he'd ever faced. The axe felt different in John's hands than it had in his father's, and different still from how it had felt in his grandfather's grip before that. 3 generations had swung this tool, its head replaced twice, its handle 3 times, yet somehow remaining the same axe that had cleared the land for his grandfather's first homestead. "Ship of Theseus," John muttered, through frozen lips, as he positioned another log on the chopping block outside the emergency shelter. His philosophy professor would be amused to find that particular thought experiment surfacing now, at the edge of survival. The morning had brought momentary reprieve, wind diminished enough to risk gathering more firewood. Temperature remained brutally low, but clear skies allowed precious sunlight to reach his solar panels. Small mercy. John's breath formed clouds of crystallized vapor with each swing of the axe. The satisfying chunk of blade biting into wood punctuated his labored breathing. Despite the cold's attempt to penetrate his layers, sweat formed along his spine with the exertion. Dangerous, in these conditions. Moisture froze quickly, stealing body heat at an accelerated rate. A sharp crack from the forest edge halted his rhythm. Not wood splitting, something moving through the frozen underbrush. John set down the axe carefully, reaching instead for the rifle leaned against the shelter wall. He scanned the tree line, eyes narrowed against reflected sunlight. Nothing moved. The forest held unnatural stillness, as if holding its breath alongside him. After long minutes, John returned to his task, though keeping the rifle closer. 12 logs. It would have to be enough. Each trip outside increased risk, and dark clouds building on the horizon promised the clear weather was temporary. John gathered the split wood, stacking it efficiently beside the shelter door, then collected his tools. The shelter interior felt almost warm after the external temperature. The photograph lay face up on the small table, its edges worn from years of handling. Rebecca at her college graduation, cap slightly askew, smile brilliant and carefree. The only image John had kept when he left civilization behind. His thumb traced the edge of the frame, careful not to touch the precious image itself. "You'd be disappointed in your old man right now," he murmured. Morning had brought fresh challenges. The woodpile, left exposed despite his efforts to cover it, had developed a thick casing of ice. Each log required precious energy to free, energy he couldn't afford to waste. The journey to his main cabin to retrieve more supplies now seemed impossibly dangerous, with temperatures dropping further and visibility reduced to mere feet. John's head throbbed with a dull persistence that worried him. Dehydration, perhaps, or early carbon monoxide from the poorly ventilated stove. He'd need to check the flue again, though it meant exposing himself briefly to the external temperature. His daughter's face watched him as he pulled on gloves with clumsy fingers. Rebecca had inherited her mother's practical nature along with her smile. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself and fix the problem," she would have said. The thought almost made him smile. The ladder to the roof was little more than a reinforced set of handholds on the shelter's exterior wall. Each rung burned cold through John's gloves as he climbed, wind buffeting him with casual malice. The metal chimney pipe had indeed developed ice buildup around its cap, partially blocking exhaust. John chipped away at it methodically, fingers growing numb despite protection. The final piece of ice dislodged suddenly, causing John to lose balance. His hand slipped from the frozen rung, body twisting awkwardly. For a sickening moment, he hung suspended by one hand, 7 feet above the snow-covered ground. Then gravity claimed him. The landing drove air from his lungs, pain blossoming instantly across his left side. His head struck something hard beneath the snow, a rock or fallen branch. For several seconds the white world turned grey, then black at the edges. "Get up," the voice, Sarah's voice, pierced the encroaching darkness. John gasped, drawing painful breath into reluctant lungs. His ribs screamed in protest as he rolled onto his side, then laboriously to his knees. Blood stained the snow beneath where his head had rested. Bad, but survivable. The pain in his side suggested bruised or possibly cracked ribs. Also survivable. The rising wind and his soaked clothing were the more immediate threats. "Move or die," John growled through gritted teeth, forcing himself upright. The shelter door seemed miles away, though rationally he knew it was less than 10 feet. Each step sent shards of pain through his side. The world tilted and swayed around him. Not good. Concussion likely. Inside he collapsed onto the small cot, shivering violently now. Wet clothing needed to be removed immediately. John fought with buttons and zippers, fingers unresponsive, coordination compromised. Sarah's voice urged him on, though rationally he knew it was memory, not reality. The small first aid kit yielded limited resources. John pressed a gauze pad against his scalp wound, securing it with athletic tape from the kit. The mirror revealed a nasty gash, but head wounds always bled dramatically. More concerning was the dilation of his pupils and the nausea rising in his throat. Classic concussion symptoms. "Rebecca," he whispered, reaching for the photograph as darkness crowded the edges of his vision. "Should have tried harder with you." Sleep pulled at him with dangerous persuasion. John knew the risks. Concussion victims shouldn't sleep immediately. But exhaustion and cold conspired against consciousness. The fire had died to embers during his struggle. John forced himself to add kindling, then a small log, movements robotic and detached. The temperature inside the shelter had dropped dangerously. If he lost consciousness now, with the fire dying and wet clothes still clinging to his skin, he wouldn't wake again. His grandmother's voice joined Sarah's in his mind. "Cold kills slowly until it kills quickly," she used to say. "Respect it always." John stripped the remaining wet layers, wrapping himself in the emergency thermal blanket from his pack. The reflective material crinkled with each shiver that racked his injured frame. He needed to elevate his feet, warm his core gradually, stay awake until the worst had passed. Rebecca's face watched him from the photograph as he fought to maintain consciousness. What would she think, knowing her father might die alone in a frozen wasteland because of a simple fall? Would she mourn him, or had the emotional connection severed completely years ago? Not dying today, John muttered defiantly, though no one was there to hear. Not like this. The fire gradually reclaimed the small space, pushing back the deadly cold 1 degree at a time. John focused on the photograph, using it as an anchor against the darkness that periodically threatened to engulf his consciousness. "Should have told you," he whispered to his daughter's image, "about the mountains, about why I needed them. Should have made you understand." Night descended outside, indistinguishable from day, except for the deeper penetration of cold, the more absolute quality of isolation. John's thoughts grew increasingly disjointed, memories and present reality blending seamlessly. Sarah sitting beside him on the cot. Rebecca, as a child, learning to fish in the stream behind their first home. His father demonstrating proper axe technique. Somewhere in the darkness outside, the wolf howled, a long, haunting note that seemed to vibrate through the shelter's thin walls. A sound simultaneously mournful and threatening, a reminder that nature remained the ultimate arbiter of survival. The metal canister felt unnaturally heavy in John's hands. His last can of coffee, a luxury he'd rationed carefully over months, saving it for moments that required special fortification. This qualified. 3 days had passed since his fall. The head wound had stopped bleeding, though dizziness persisted when he moved too quickly. His ribs protested every breath, every movement, a constant reminder of his newfound vulnerability. But it was the cold that had become his true adversary. The thermometer had stopped functioning at -22°C, the liquid frozen solid within the glass tube. John estimated the actual temperature now approached -30. He measured coffee grounds with ritual precision, the familiar aroma briefly transforming the shelter into something approaching comfort as he added snow-melt water to the small pot. His grandmother had called coffee medicine for the spirit. Today, his spirit needed intensive care outside. The storm had reached an apex of fury that transcended normal weather patterns. Wind screamed through the trees with banshee wails. Snow fell so heavily it seemed solid rather than individual flakes. The world beyond the shelter's walls had ceased to exist in any meaningful way, replaced by a howling void of white. John sipped the precious coffee, allowing himself to acknowledge the gravity of his situation. The injury had cost him dearly. Energy expenditure increased while his capacity for gathering supplies diminished. Food stores would last another 3 weeks, if strictly rationed. Firewood perhaps 10 days. The medications he'd brought from the main cabin had been depleted treating his injuries. Not the best odds, he murmured to the empty shelter. The night had been the worst yet. Temperatures had dropped to levels that made the metal walls of the shelter contract with rifle-shot cracks. The small stove struggled against physics, heat dissipating faster than it could be generated. John had slept in short increments, waking to add precious fuel to the fire, each time fighting the seductive urge to let sleep claim him permanently. Twice, he'd been certain he heard scratching at the door, wolves or some other desperate predator sensing vulnerability. Once, he could have sworn he heard Sarah's voice calling his name from the darkness outside. The lines between reality and hallucination had begun to blur at the edges. The coffee cleared his mind temporarily, bringing his predicament into sharper focus. If conditions remained unchanged, his survival window would close rapidly. The ranger in him calculated dispassionate odds, less than 40% chance without intervention or dramatic weather improvement. The man beneath the ranger's training refused to accept the calculation. John reached for his journal, recording observations with scientific detachment. temperature estimates, fuel consumption rates, food inventory, physical condition notes. The act itself a refusal to surrender. Documentation presumed future readers, presumed survival. A particularly violent gust rocked the entire shelter, momentarily drowning out all other sounds. When it subsided, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic scratching at the roof, different from wind-blown branches, deliberate, methodical. John reached for the rifle, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The scratching continued, moving laterally across the metal surface. Not an animal, too consistent, too purposeful, ice damming perhaps, or snow load shifting. He lowered the weapon, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The coffee had grown cold in his hands, the last cup, likely. John drank it anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. The grounds would be repurposed, mixed with the last of his jerky to extend provisions by another day. Waste had become unconscionable luxury. Night approached again, the seventh since the temperature had dropped below -20. Each darkness lasted longer, demanded more resources, tested his resolve with greater intensity. John added precious logs to the stove, calculating remaining supply against estimated need. The equation remained stubbornly unfavorable. He found himself speaking aloud, though no one could hear. "You've painted yourself into a corner this time, old man." The shelter felt increasingly like a tomb, walls pressing closer with each passing hour, air growing stale despite ventilation efforts. Isolation becoming a tangible presence that shared the space with him. John had sought solitude for years, embraced it as salvation after Sarah's death. The irony wasn't lost on him that excessive solitude might now claim his life in return. The wolf pack's howls had changed tenor over recent days, growing more desperate, more frequent. Starvation would claim weaker pack members soon. The stronger ones would grow bolder, instinct overriding natural caution around humans. John checked the rifle again, confirming the chamber was loaded, safety engaged but accessible. He placed the empty coffee can carefully on the shelf, unwilling to discard it. Its presence a reminder of civilization, of small comforts now beyond reach. In the gathering darkness, John allowed himself a moment of honesty few survivors would articulate, not fear of death itself, but fear of dying without reconciliation, without closure, without passing on the accumulated wisdom his life had generated at such cost. Outside, something large moved through the deep snow, deliberate footsteps, circling the perimeter of his shelter. The wolf had returned, bolder now, assessing weakness with predator's intuition. John raised the rifle, listening as the footsteps paused outside his door. Man and beast separated by thin metal, each fighting private battles against the same implacable enemy, a winter determined to claim every living thing within its frozen domain. The trap lay in pieces at John's feet, twisted metal, rendered useless by some powerful force. This had been his last functional snare, carefully set near the shelter, where tracks suggested small game might still venture. Now it was just one more failed strategy in an increasingly desperate situation. "Damn it all," he muttered, gathering the broken components. The metal could be repurposed, perhaps. In survival situations, nothing was truly useless until all potential applications had been exhausted. 10 days had passed since temperatures plummeted below survivable thresholds. Each day brought new challenges, new failures, new calculations of diminishing odds. The storm had settled into a rhythm of relative calm, punctuated by periods of renewed fury, as if gathering strength for final assault. John's injury had improved marginally, ribs still painful, but head wound healing without signs of infection. Small mercies. His food stores had dwindled faster than anticipated. The constant cold demanded more calories simply to maintain body temperature, biology superseding willpower. He turned the broken trap over in his hands, examining the damage more carefully. Not weather-related. The metal had been crushed, bent outward by something applying force from inside. Something had triggered the mechanism, been caught, then escaped through sheer power. Wolf, most likely. A desperate, hungry predator, ignoring pain to escape confinement. John understood the sentiment all too well. Inside the shelter, he added precious kindling to the stove, coaxing flames from dying embers. His daily routine had contracted to essential functions only. Maintain heat, melt snow for water, consume minimal calories, conserve energy. The simplicity would have been almost meditative under different circumstances. The small calendar he'd marked dutifully each morning suggested February had arrived, though dates had lost meaning beyond tracking storm duration. 11 weeks until normal spring thaw, according to patterns recorded in his journal. 11 weeks that stretched before him like an impossible distance. John paused in his fire tending, attention drawn to movement outside the small window. Not snow or wind, something deliberate. The tracks appeared overnight, human footprints cutting a deliberate line through fresh snow 30 yards from the shelter. John knelt beside them, breath-forming clouds in the frigid air as he studied the impression, definite eated prints. Large, likely male, the tread pattern unfamiliar, not his own tracks, not backfilled snow depressions. Someone else was out here, impossible, he muttered, yet the evidence remained stubbornly present. The storm had granted temporary reprieve, sunlight glinting off endless white with painful brilliance. John had ventured out to check his reconstructed traps, finding them empty but intact. Then he'd spotted the tracks, a straight line emerging from the eastern pine stand, continuing west toward the ridge that separated his territory from the next valley. John followed the prints cautiously, rifle ready, ranger instincts fully engaged. The trail maintained consistent stride length and depth, suggesting someone moving with purpose rather than struggling through deep snow. No drag marks or signs of injury, just methodical progress through terrain that should have been impassable to anyone without snowshoes or skis. The tracks disappeared at the ridge edge, as if their maker had simply vanished or taken flight. John scanned the valley beyond, seeing only unbroken white stretching to the horizon. His mind cycled through possibilities: rangers on emergency patrol, lost hikers, poachers. None seemed plausible, given current conditions. The nearest outpost was 30 miles away, and no helicopter could fly in this weather. "Hello?" he called, voice swallowed immediately by the vast silence. No response except distant crow calls. John photographed the tracks in his mind: size, depth, stride length, direction, details that might make sense later when his brain had time to process them. For now, the immediate implication was both concerning and oddly comforting. He was not entirely alone in this frozen wasteland. Returning to the shelter, John marked the discovery in his journal with scientific precision. 2 weeks had passed since temperatures dropped below survivable thresholds. His condition had stabilized but remained precarious. Food stores would last perhaps 5 more days at current consumption. Firewood less. The mysterious tracks added a new variable to survival calculations: potential threat or salvation. The day passed in essential tasks: melting snow, tending fire, checking traps. John found himself repeatedly drawn to the window, scanning the ridge where the tracks had disappeared. Part of him hoped to see their creator return. A larger part dreaded the prospect of confrontation in his weakened state. By late afternoon, clouds had reclaimed the sky, temperature dropping precipitously as sunset approached. John added precious fuel to the stove, watching flames consume resources he couldn't replace. The fire's warmth penetrated his layers inadequately, body heat diminished by weeks of insufficient caloric intake. The wolves had been absent today, concerning in its own way. Their behavior had grown increasingly coordinated, almost strategic. Now their disappearance coincided with the mysterious tracks. Connection or coincidence? John's ranger training favored data over speculation, but isolation had loosened the boundaries between observation and interpretation. Night fell with absolute darkness, stars obscured by renewed cloud cover. John positioned himself on the small cot, rifle within reach, fighting exhaustion that pulled at him with physical weight. Sleep had become dangerous indulgence, each time potentially the last if fire died or temperature dropped beyond critical thresholds. The wind carried sounds difficult to interpret, perhaps branches scraping against metal roof, perhaps deliberate movement. John strained to separate natural noise from potential threat, senses heightened by adrenaline despite exhaustion. The scratching came again, rhythmic, intentional, not wind or snow load shifting. Something was methodically testing the integrity of his shelter's roof. John raised the rifle, tracking sound with barrel, finger resting lightly beside trigger. Movement at the window, a shadow passing briefly across frosted glass. Too quick to identify, too deliberate to dismiss. John moved silently to better position, years of hunting experience guiding movements despite injury and fatigue. "Who's there?" he called, voice steadier than expected. No response except wind's constant moaning through pine boughs. Minutes passed in frozen vigilance before John's attention was drawn to the door. Latch, moving incrementally, metal scraping against metal with microscopic precision. Someone or something attempting entry with calculated patience. John aimed directly at the door, muscles trembling slightly from prolonged tension and malnutrition. "Identify yourself," he commanded, Ranger authority temporarily overriding civilian uncertainty. The latch stopped moving. Silence stretched, broken only by fire's soft consumption of precious fuel. Then footsteps, moving away from door, circling shelter with unhurried purpose. Human cadence, but somehow wrong, too consistent across variable snow depth. Too mechanical in rhythm. Through the window, John caught glimpse of a figure retreating toward tree line, tall, dressed in dark clothing that absorbed rather than reflected moonlight that occasionally broke through clouds. The stride matched tracks discovered earlier, purposeful, efficient, unhampered by deep snow or deadly cold. At the forest edge, the figure paused, turning back toward the shelter. Distance and darkness prevented clear view of features, but John felt the weight of observation, studying him as he studied it. Then the figure raised one hand in what might have been greeting or warning before disappearing into darkness beyond the trees. John lowered the rifle, suddenly aware of heart pounding painfully against injured ribs. The encounter raised more questions than it answered. Human presence in these conditions defied logical explanation, yet evidence remained undeniable. Tracks in snow, manipulated door latch, direct observation. He moved to the journal, recording details with shaking hands before memory could distort them. The act itself affirmation of rational thought against encroaching wilderness madness that isolation and extreme conditions invited. Science and documentation as anchors to sanity. Outside, the storm resumed its assault, erasing all evidence of the mysterious visitor beneath fresh layers of snow and ice. John added the last log to dying embers, preserving heat for few more precious hours against the long darkness that stretched before dawn. The compass face bore a spiderweb of cracks, its glass fractured years ago during a particularly difficult rescue operation. Despite the damage, the needle still swung true, finding magnetic north with unwavering certainty. John held it level in his palm, watching the needle stabilize, then adjusted his bearing accordingly. East-southeast. If his calculations were correct, this heading would intersect with Crawford Creek, which remained unfrozen in places due its swift current. Water, fish perhaps, resources worth the risk of leaving shelter temporarily. 3 days had passed since the encounter with the mysterious visitor. No further signs had appeared, though John had maintained vigilant watch. The storm had settled into a pattern of relative calm during daylight, fury resuming with nightfall. His supplies had dwindled to critical levels. 2 days of food remaining, firewood exhausted by evening. The equation had simplified to stark terms: venture out or perish inside. John secured the compass in his breast pocket, patting it once for reassurance. Sarah had given him this instrument on their 5th anniversary, replacing one lost during a backcountry operation. "So you can always find your way home," she'd said. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Home had become a relative concept, reduced to wherever he could maintain life for another day. The bitter cold struck immediately as he opened the shelter door, driving air from his lungs in shocked response. Morning temperature still hovered near -20, though sunlight offered illusion of warmth. John pulled the scarf across his face, leaving only eyes exposed as he secured the door behind him. Movement required careful calculation, speed balanced against exertion, distance against exposure time. John had fashioned crude snowshoes from shelter materials, improving mobility somewhat, though still requiring significant energy expenditure. Each step deliberate, measured against remaining strength. He followed the compass bearing through terrain rendered unrecognizable by snow accumulation, familiar landmarks, distinctive trees, rock formations, game trails, all buried beneath uniform white. Only the sun's position and the compass provided navigation reference as John pushed steadily toward the creek drainage. Twice he stopped to rest, controlling breathing to minimize heat loss through respiration. His body felt simultaneously leaden and hollow, muscles strained from constant cold resistance, while calories burned faster than they could be replaced. Survival math growing more unfavorable with each passing hour. A raven passed overhead, its harsh call breaking the silence. John followed its flight path automatically. Ranger's habit of noting wildlife behavior as environmental indicator. The bird circled once before continuing southeast, the same direction his compass pointed. John allowed himself a tight smile, perhaps an omen of better fortune. The terrain dipped suddenly, snow depth decreasing as gradient increased. John recognized the topography, approaching the creek drainage. He moved more carefully now, aware that snow cornices could conceal dangerous drops where water had carved the landscape. The sound reached him first, running water, the gentle gurgle of current moving beneath partial ice cover. Hope flared briefly, tempered immediately by practical assessment. Moving water meant potential food source, but also hazard. Falling into creek even briefly would mean certain death from hypothermia. John followed the sound until the creek came into view, a dark ribbon winding through white landscape. Sections remained open, steam rising where water met frigid air. Other portions disappeared beneath ice bridges and snow accumulation. He studied flow patterns, identifying potentially productive pools where fish might conserve energy in slower current. Movement caught his peripheral vision, something dark against pristine snow on the opposite bank. John turned slowly, hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt, the only weapon he'd brought besides a gaff hook for fishing. Human tracks, emerging from forest edge, approaching creek, then turning to follow its course downstream. The same boot print pattern he'd observed days earlier near his shelter. Fresh, the impressions crisp-edged in new snow. John consulted the compass again, confirming his position relative to shelter. The mysterious visitor had traveled at least 3 miles through lethal conditions, somehow maintaining straight-line efficiency through terrain that forced even experienced outdoorsmen to zigzag around obstacles. Logic suggested following the tracks downstream. They likely led to something significant enough to justify difficult journey. Yet instinct urged caution, the same primal warning system that had kept him alive through decades in wilderness. Think it through, he muttered. Sarah's practical voice surfacing in memory. Curiosity versus survival. Investigation versus immediate needs. John studied the creek again, noting a promising pool 50 yards upstream from the mysterious tracks. Deep water, partially sheltered by overhanging bank, likely fish refuge during winter conditions. Decision made, he moved carefully to the position, avoiding thin ice areas through hard-earned experience. The gaff hook, fashioned from wire coat hanger and shelter materials, felt insubstantial against the task at hand, but John had caught fish with less in younger days. An hour yielded success beyond reasonable expectation. 2 trout, smaller than summer specimens but substantial given current circumstances. Protein, fat, calories, life extension measured in days rather than hours. John secured his catch, conscious of time and temperature, both working against safe return. The tracks remained visible downstream, temptation pulling against pragmatism. John checked the compass again, recalculating position, estimating daylight remaining, sufficient for brief investigation before returning to shelter. He followed the mysterious trail cautiously, moving parallel rather than directly in the footprints. Rangers learned early to preserve evidence rather than contaminate it, habit persisting despite current circumstances where official investigation seemed impossibly remote. The tracks continued with mechanical consistency along the creek bank for quarter-mile before abruptly turning toward a clearing visible through sparse trees. John paused at forest edge, surveying open area with practiced caution before proceeding. The camp appeared abandoned, snow covering tent and equipment with undisturbed perfection suggesting absence of several days. Not rangers or official rescue, equipment too crude, positioning all wrong for standard operation. Poachers perhaps, though season and conditions made little sense for such activity. John approached cautiously, senses alert for traps or human presence. The tent had partially collapsed under snow weight, a small camp stove visible near extinguished fire ring. Several supply containers secured against animal intrusion hung from tree branches. Most telling, a map secured beneath rock on makeshift table, corners fluttering slightly in occasional breeze. The compass seemed suddenly heavier in his pocket, tool of navigation now directing him toward knowledge he wasn't certain he should possess. John studied the abandoned camp with Ranger's objective assessment. Survival gear adequate, but minimal. Location peculiar, neither optimal for shelter nor hunting. Purpose unclear. The sun had begun its descent toward western peaks, temperature dropping incrementally with its withdrawal. Time to return before darkness rendered navigation exponentially more difficult. John turned away from the mystery camp, plotting return bearing with damaged but reliable compass. Questions would remain unanswered for now. Survival demanded prioritization. Fish represented immediate caloric needs met. Mystery camp represented potential future resource if desperation required further exploration. For moment compass pointed toward shelter, toward one more night of defiance against impossible odds. The wooden chess piece took form gradually beneath John's knife blade, emerging from raw pine like a figure released from imprisonment. He worked by firelight, careful strokes transforming formless material into recognizable shape. A king, standing proud despite the crude craftsmanship. Its crown was simple, its base sturdy, a ruler carved for a kingdom of one. John turned the piece in scarred fingers, examining imperfections in the carving. Time had been when such flaws would have bothered him, the slight asymmetry of the crown, the uneven base. Now they seemed appropriate. Perfection belonged to a different world, one with electricity and central heating, and grocery stores. Out here function superseded form, survival trumped aesthetics. The fish had lasted 3 days, precious protein rationed carefully, bones crushed for marrow, skin rendered for minimal fat, combined with pine needle tea for vitamin C and the remaining emergency rations. John had extended his viable timeline marginally. Perhaps enough to matter if weather patterns shifted, perhaps not. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. 20 days now of sub-zero temperatures, snow accumulation exceeding 6 feet in level areas, wind piling drifts against shelter walls that creaked under the pressure. The brief respite that had allowed fishing expedition hadn't returned. If anything, conditions had worsened, temperature dropping, wind intensifying, as if nature sensed his momentary success and responded with renewed fury. John set the chess piece alongside 5 others he'd carved during endless nights. King, queen, knight, bishop, rook, pawn. A complete set would require 16 pieces, objective extending time horizon psychologically, if not physically. The methodical work kept hands busy, mind focused on creation rather than entropy, future rather than immediate constraints. His explorations of the abandoned camp had yielded limited practical resources, emergency matches, a small container of kerosene, fishing lines superior to his improvised cordage. More valuable was the psychological impact, confirmation he wasn't entirely alone in this frozen universe, evidence others had survived similar conditions, if only temporarily. No further sign of the camp's occupants had materialized. No footprints approaching shelter, no shadows passing windows after dark. John had maintained disciplined documentation, times, locations, weather conditions, observations. The scientist in him refused to entertain supernatural explanation, yet rational alternatives seemed equally implausible given the circumstances. The wolves had returned yesterday, 5 grey shadows materializing at tree line during brief afternoon clearing. They'd maintained distance, watching shelter, with patient hunger. John recognized all too well. Their coordination had evolved further. Positions spaced equidistantly around clearing, movements synchronized without apparent communication, intelligence beyond instinct. John's hand paused in carving, knife edge resting against partially formed wooden rook. His ranger training suggested multiple disquieting possibilities. Wolves adapted rapidly to environmental pressures, could potentially evolve new behaviors when standard hunting tactics failed. Hunger drove innovation across species. Perhaps he was witnessing accelerated adaptation. Alternative explanations felt uncomfortably mystical. His grandmother's stories of spirit animals, wilderness embodiments of natural forces, tales he dismissed as cultural metaphor rather than literal description. Yet isolation and extremity created psychological conditions where objective reality blurred at edges. The rook took shape beneath renewed knife strokes, tower emerging from wooden blank. John focused on tactical considerations, practical planning superseding existential questions. Remaining supplies justified approximately 6 days at current consumption rates. Solar batteries had weakened to point of providing only minutes of electric light. Firewood would be exhausted in 3 days. Water remained abundant if energy expended to melt snow. Strategic options were limited. Return to main cabin impossible given current conditions. Evacuation to ranger station equally implausible. Shelter in place until weather moderated represented only viable choice unless new variables entered equation. John positioned the completed rook alongside other pieces on makeshift board scratched into shelter floor. Chess had been his father's game, strategy lessons extending beyond 64 squares to life application. Current position resembled late-game scenario. Few pieces remaining. King exposed, options constrained but surrender unacceptable. Your move, John murmured to unseen opponent, eyes shifting from crude chess set to window where darkness gathered with malevolent intention. His gaze caught something moving near tree line. Different from wolf profiles, more vertical, human figure perhaps. Or imagination projecting human characteristics onto natural formations through desperate need for companionship. John moved closer to frost-covered glass, straining to separate reality from illusion in fading light. The figure stood motionless at forest edge, too distant for detailed observation but unmistakably bipedal. It remained still for long moments, as if aware of John's attention, then raised one arm in gesture identical to previous encounter before melting into deepening shadows between trees. John's ranger training battled survival instinct. Investigation meant exposure to lethal conditions with minimal potential benefit. Yet the pattern suggested deliberate contact attempts rather than coincidental encounters. Intelligence directed toward uncertain purpose. The chess pieces stood arranged for battle on improvised board. King protected by diminishing resources, opponent's strategy unclear, but pressure mounting inexorably. John added final wood to stove, watching flames consume remaining fuel with greedy efficiency. Heat would diminish through night, temperature inside shelter dropping to dangerous levels before dawn. Decision crystallized with sudden clarity. Passive waiting equaled certain failure through resource depletion. Active engagement with unknown variables introduced risk, but also potential salvation. The mysterious visitor, the abandoned camp, the coordinated wolves. connected elements in environmental equation he'd failed to solve through conventional analysis. John lifted the carved king, studying its crude features in dying firelight. Leaders acted despite incomplete information when circumstances demanded. His father's chess lessons returning in memory. Sometimes sacrifice proved necessary for ultimate victory. Sometimes apparent retreat enabled future advance. Tomorrow would require venturing out again. Longer journey, greater risk, uncertain outcome. The chess pieces would remain arranged in strategic defense, silent witnesses to decision that might prove salvation or final error, in wilderness calculation, where mistakes allowed no recovery, where nature's indifferent judgment rendered all human strategic thinking merely temporary defiance against inevitable conclusion. The medicine bottle felt unnaturally light in John's hand, pills rattling loosely against plastic as he shook out the last 2 tablets. The label had worn partially away. Ranger Station issue. Basic antibiotics prescribed for wilderness emergencies. He'd brought them from the main cabin when relocating to the emergency shelter, never imagining they would become so critical. Not much of a legacy, he muttered, swallowing one pill dry and returning the other to the bottle. Last dose, to be saved for tomorrow if tomorrow came. The infection had developed with alarming speed, his earlier head wound reopening during wood collection, exposure to something in the snow, or perhaps lingering bacteria, finding perfect growth conditions in his weakened system. Red streaks now extended from the wound across his scalp, fever building despite efforts to control it with snow compresses. John knew the progression all too well, seen it in rescued hikers, fellow rangers caught in backcountry emergencies. Without proper treatment, systemic infection would spread through bloodstream, affecting major organs within days. The single remaining antibiotic represented desperate holding action rather than solution. Outside, the storm had temporarily abated, weak sunlight filtering through clouds that seemed permanently installed above the mountains. Temperature had risen marginally, perhaps -15 instead of -25. Still lethal, but offering slightly improved odds for what he needed to attempt. The fever brought waves of disorientation, moments where past and present merged seamlessly, where Sarah sat beside him on the small cot, offering comfort with cool hands against his forehead, where his father explained chess strategies with patient determination. John fought to separate memory from reality, knowing survival demanded clear cognition despite biology's interference. He secured essential supplies with methodical precision despite trembling hands: compass, knife, emergency rations, fire starter, the carved chess king tucked into breast pocket as talisman. The rifle would remain behind, too heavy given his weakened condition. Ammunition nearly depleted anyway. The fishing gaff might serve dual purpose as tool and weapon if necessity arose. "One problem at a time," he whispered, Sarah's voice overlapping his own as if she stood beside him offering guidance. "Just solve what's in front of you." The abandoned camp represented closest potential salvation, possibility of additional medical supplies, communication equipment, perhaps even its occupants returned from whatever purpose had drawn them into this frozen wilderness. 3 miles across difficult terrain, dangerous journey in optimal condition, potentially fatal given current circumstances. John checked the compass once more, plotting bearing in mind rather than marking map that would likely blow away in first strong gust. Southeast initially, following creek drainage, then southerly adjustment to reach clearing where camp had been positioned. Simple navigation made exponentially more difficult by physical deterioration and periodic disorientation. He stepped outside, locking shelter door through force of habit rather than practical necessity. No one would likely pass this way again until spring thaw, assuming the shelter remained standing against accumulated snow weight and structural stress. Movement immediately confirmed fever's impact, limbs responding sluggishly to mental commands, balance compromised, visual field occasionally blurring at periphery. John focused on mechanical process, one foot before other, consistent direction, energy conservation through efficient motion, ranger training providing operational framework, when physical systems threatened failure. The crude snowshoes improved mobility marginally, though each step still required significant exertion through snow reaching mid-thigh in places. John maintained deliberate pace, monitoring internal condition through objective assessment, respiration rate, muscle fatigue, cognitive clarity. The infection worked against him, with silent efficiency, elevated temperature creating illusion of warmth that increased danger of overexertion. Halfway to creek drainage, he paused, leaning against pine trunk for momentary rest. The fever wavered, reality briefly crystallizing with painful clarity. He was miles from any potential help, infected wound worsening by hour, temperature still low enough to kill within hours if he lost consciousness or became disoriented. The logical assessment offered minimal chance of survival regardless of decisions made now. "Doesn't matter," John murmured, pushing away from temporary support. "Forward is only option." The fever surged again as he resumed movement, bringing Sarah's presence so vividly he could almost feel her hand in his. "You always were stubborn," her voice chided gently in his mind. "Wouldn't let them evacuate you during that forest fire in different circumstances," he argued with the hallucination, recognizing its nature while drawing comfort from imagined company. The creek appeared through trees ahead, dark ribbon winding through white landscape. John consulted compass again, adjusting bearings slightly to compensate for drift during travel. The abandoned camp lay approximately 1 mile downstream, assuming it remained in position rather than temporary phenomenon like its occupant. Movement along creek bank required careful attention, ice shelves extending unpredictably over water, snow bridges concealing potentially fatal drop-offs. John tested each step methodically despite growing urgency as fever intensified. Falls represented unacceptable risk, given current condition. The raven appeared without warning, landing on snow-covered boulder directly in path. Large specimen, glossy black feathers contrasting starkly against surrounding whiteness. It regarded John with unsettling intelligence, head cocking sideways in assessment rather than fear. "Checking my progress." John addressed it through fever-induced familiarity, rationality recognizing yet accepting anthropomorphic projection as harmless coping mechanism. The bird maintained position until he approached within arm's length, then launched into air with powerful wing strokes, proceeding downstream in precisely the direction John traveled. It landed again further along creek bank, waiting until he approached before repeating pattern. Logic recognized coincidental movement pattern of scavenger species habituated to human presence. Fever suggested alternative interpretation, guide, messenger, embodiment of his grandmother's stories about natural world's intelligence, transcending human understanding. John followed regardless, practical destination aligning with Raven's apparent direction. The fever peaked suddenly, bringing wave of dizziness that forced him to knees in deep snow. The infection advancing faster than anticipated, systemic effects intensifying despite antibiotics' limited action. John breathed deeply through momentary disorientation, forcing mind to maintain operational focus despite biology's accelerating betrayal. When vision cleared, the raven had vanished. In its place stood figure from previous encounters, tall, dressed in dark clothing, features indistinct at current distance. It observed him without apparent concern or urgency, merely witnessing his struggle against converging forces of infection and environment. "Who are you?" John called, voice weaker than intended, words catching in throat dried by fever and exertion. The figure made no response beyond slight adjustment of position, turning slightly downstream, arm extending in directional indication that might have been invitation or command. Then it moved away with that same unnatural efficiency across difficult terrain, maintaining consistent pace impossible to match in John's deteriorating condition. He followed nevertheless, determination transcending physical limitation, unconsciously touching carved chess king in breast pocket like talisman against mounting odds. The game remained unfinished, final moves yet to be played, despite opponent's overwhelming advantage. The improvised snowshoes creaked beneath John's weight, bent wood and salvaged cordage, somehow maintaining integrity despite stress far beyond intended design capacity. He'd fashioned them from cabin shelving and paracord in desperate innovation when the storm first intensified, crude but functional, enabling limited mobility through deep snow that would otherwise render travel impossible. Engineering by necessity, his father would have called it. The old man had possessed uncanny ability to create essential tools from seemingly useless materials, talent passed to son through both genetics and patient instruction during formative years. John paused, leaning heavily against pine trunk, for support as fever sent fresh wave of dizziness cascading through weakened frame. The infection had progressed alarmingly, red streaks now extending from scalp wound down temple toward jawline. The last antibiotic tablet consumed hours earlier represented symbolic resistance rather than medical solution against advancing bacterial invasion. The mysterious figure had disappeared again, melting into forest ahead with that same unnerving efficiency across terrain that forced John to struggle for every yard gain. Yet somehow the path seemed prepared before him, subtle indications of direction, branches positioned to suggest optimal route, occasional cleared spaces where snow depth diminished precisely where his strength threatened to fail. Coincidence or design? He muttered through cracked lips. The fever made distinction between reality and hallucination increasingly problematic, perception filtered through biological disruption that transformed ordinary wilderness into something approaching mythological landscape from his grandmother's stories. The abandoned camp appeared through trees ahead, altered significantly since previous visit. Snow had been cleared methodically from central area, equipment reorganized, new structures added that hadn't existed days earlier. Most notably, smoke rose from small stovepipe, extending from primary tent, indicating recent occupancy. John approached cautiously despite desperate need for assistance, ranger training overriding immediate impulse. The site remained eerily silent. No movement, no voices, despite obvious signs of recent activity. They scanned surroundings carefully, cataloging changes with professional detachment despite physical deterioration. The tent entrance hung partially open, interior illuminated by soft glow, suggesting lantern or candle rather than electric light. John called out, voice rasping through throat, dried by fever and exertion. No response beyond wind's constant movement through pine boughs. "Hello? Anyone present?" He tried again, advancing slowly toward the tent, fishing gaff held loosely in right hand. Insufficient weapon against human threat, but providing minimal security nonetheless. The tent interior revealed careful organization. Sleeping bag positioned precisely, supplies arranged with military precision, small stove radiating precious heat that struck John's face like physical blessing after hours exposed to sub-zero conditions. Most significantly, medical kit lay open atop small folding table, contents suggesting recent use, antiseptic wrappers discarded, bandage packaging opened, prescription bottles arranged by apparent purpose. No occupant, despite environmental evidence suggesting departure within past hour. John scanned surrounding forest once more, seeking movement or indication of imminent return. Nothing visible through trees that creaked beneath accumulated ice and snow weight. The fever spiked suddenly, driving him to knees beside tent entrance, vision tunneling momentarily as infection leveraged advantage against weakened immune response. When perception clarified, decision crystallized with surprising clarity. Utilize available resources, regardless of ownership questions that remained unanswered. Survival superseded property considerations in wilderness emergency scenarios. Basic tenet of backcountry ethics John had taught countless junior rangers during professional lifetime. He moved to medical supplies with desperate efficiency, examining labels through vision that periodically clouded edges. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, significantly stronger than depleted ranger station supply he'd exhausted. Prescription strength, anti-inflammatory medication, topical antiseptics. proper wound dressing materials rather than improvised solutions he'd relied upon. John administered treatment with shaking hands, medical training combining with survival necessity to override physical deterioration. Proper dose, appropriate wound cleaning, despite pain that sent fresh waves of nausea through already compromised system. Pressure bandage applied with precision despite limited dexterity. The tent offered temporary sanctuary against lethal external conditions. Temperature differential between interior and exterior, approaching 50 degrees through simple wood stoves' efficient design. John added small piece of split wood from neatly stacked pile beside stove. Actions automatic despite questions regarding supply's origin that buzzed through fever-influenced consciousness. His attention fixed on single incongruous element among meticulously organized camp. Small feather positioned precisely atop, topographical map, secured to folding table surface. Not random placement. Intentional marker drawing attention to specific location circled in red on map representation of surrounding wilderness. John studied indicated position through vision that alternated between crystalline clarity and disturbing distortion, as fever battled medication not yet fully engaged with systemic infection. The marked location corresponded to natural hot springs, approximately 2 miles southeast of current position. Geological anomaly he'd documented during ranger surveys years earlier, but considered inaccessible during winter conditions. The map annotation included precise coordinates and single-word inscription: tomorrow, invitation, instruction, hallucination. John touched the eagle feather gently. Material connection to physical reality, grounding perception, temporarily, against fever's disorienting influence. The feather's structure remained consistent, despite visual disruption, primary vein intact, barbs aligned with geometric precision, righteous exhibiting characteristic central rigidity. Beyond tent walls, afternoon light faded toward evening darkness that would bring renewed temperature drop and increased exposure risk if travel attempted. The camp offered temporary shelter, medical resources, and heat source that represented survival advantage against deteriorating physical condition. Yet questions regarding ownership, purpose, and apparent invitation suggested decisions more complex than immediate survival calculations. John positioned snowshoes carefully beside tent entrance, symbolic boundary marking transition between wilderness struggle and temporary sanctuary that raised as many questions as it answered. The chess king carved from pine remained in breast pocket, unconscious hand movement confirming its presence. Talisman, representing strategic resistance against opponent whose identity remained unclear despite mounting evidence of deliberate engagement rather than coincidental wilderness encounter. Outside, wind increased incrementally as darkness approached. Familiar pattern established over weeks of storm behavior. Inside, medication began tentative engagement with infection that had nearly claimed victory through biological warfare, waged within compromised terrain of human physiology, subjected to extreme environmental conditions. The eagle feather turned slowly between John's fingers, its structure catching morning light filtering through tent canvas. Primary feather from mature golden eagle, flight pinion, right wing, probably molted naturally rather than harvested, based on shaft condition, significant to indigenous cultures throughout region, representing connection between earth and sky, messenger between physical and spiritual realms. Quite the coincidence, John murmured, though certainty regarding coincidental nature had eroded significantly through accumulation of experiences defying conventional explanation. The medication had worked with surprising efficiency overnight, fever reduced from dangerous peaks to manageable elevation, wound inflammation visibly diminished, cognitive function improved beyond survival calculus to encompass broader consideration. Still far from healed, but trajectory altered from terminal decline toward potential recovery. Outside, morning had brought calm, unlike anything experienced in weeks. Wind diminished to occasional breeze, temperature risen to perhaps -10, cloud cover thinned to allow actual sunlight rather than diffused illumination. Not safety by any rational wilderness standard, but comparative reprieve that might enable necessary travel. The map remained on folding table where he'd studied it repeatedly through night, interrupted by medication schedule maintained with military precision. The marked location, Natural Hot Springs, represented approximately 4 miles southeast of current position. Difficult journey in optimal condition, potentially lethal given current physical deterioration despite medical intervention. Yet the single-word inscription "tomorrow" created timelines suggesting urgency beyond recovery considerations. Tomorrow meaning today, given annotation discovered yesterday. Purpose unclear, but implication undeniable. Someone wanted him at that location, had provided medical resources necessary to make journey survivable, had perhaps been manipulating circumstances from shadows since temperature first plummeted below survivable thresholds. John secured the feather carefully in breast pocket alongside carved chess king, twin talismans representing incompatible worldviews that nevertheless coexisted within his experience. Scientific materialism versus indigenous spirituality. Ranger training versus grandmother's teachings. Practical survival versus metaphysical interpretation. Doesn't matter which explanation is correct if outcome keeps you alive, he told himself. Pragmatism overriding philosophical considerations. Preparation for journey required careful inventory assessment. The mysterious camp occupants had left resources suggesting anticipated needs, additional antibiotics, with doses clearly marked for coming days, high-calorie emergency rations, chemical heat packs designed for medical application. Coincidence strained credulity beyond breaking point. Assistance calibrated too precisely to specific condition. John transferred essential supplies to his pack, leaving note detailing items taken, ethical response despite emergency circumstance. The improved snowshoes positioned beside tent entrance weren't his crude fabrications but professionally crafted equipment perfectly sized to his boot dimensions. Another impossible specificity given isolation and condition. Getting harder to maintain skepticism, John acknowledged to empty tent. He secured additional layers before facing external conditions. Temperature improved but still lethal if proper precautions ignored. The antibiotics had reduced infection but weakness remained significant limitation. Energy reserves depleted through weeks of insufficient caloric intake and constant cold stress. Outside, the landscape had transformed under clear sky, harsh but undeniably beautiful. Sunlight reflected from endless white with diamond brilliance. Pine boughs released accumulated snow in occasional miniature avalanches. Distant peaks emerged from cloud cover with majestic indifference to human struggle beneath their towering presence. John consulted compass and map once more, confirming bearing toward Hot Springs, southeast initially, following natural drainage, then eastward adjustment for final approach. Simple navigation made complex by physical limitation and terrain challenges. He tested new snowshoes with careful weight distribution, noting significant improvement over improvised equipment, flotation enhanced, binding security optimized, weight distribution engineered for efficiency. The raven appeared as he prepared to depart. Same specimen, he felt certain, despite scientific inability to confirm individual identification. It landed on nearby pine branch, dislodging snow with deliberate wing adjustment, regarding him with that same unsettling intelligence that transcended normal wildlife behavior. "You again," John addressed it with familiarity born of isolation and fever-induced perception shift. Following or leading, the bird offered no clarification beyond head tilt, suggesting either curiosity or communication attempt, interpreted through human cognitive framework. After moments observation, it launched from branch with powerful wing strokes, proceeding southeast along precisely the bearing John had calculated toward destination. "That answers that question," he murmured, adjusting pack straps before following with measured pace calibrated to conserve energy while maintaining progress. The journey unfolded with dreamlike quality, physical exertion undeniable, yet somehow distanced, pain present but manageable, landscape simultaneously familiar and transformed through altered perspective, induced by recent experience. The small green chute pushed defiantly through melting snow beside the hot spring, its emergence impossibly early, given seasonal conditions that maintained winter's grip everywhere except this geological anomaly. John knelt beside it, gloved fingers hovering just above tender leaves without touching, confirmation of life's persistence despite overwhelming environmental resistance. Indian paintbrush, he identified, botanical knowledge surfacing automatically, despite circumstances that might have justified focus exclusively on immediate survival concerns. The mysterious figure had departed after their brief, enigmatic encounter. Few words exchanged beyond identification and acknowledgement, yet communication accomplished through means transcending conventional dialogue. Direction provided. Instruction imparted. John had been guided to remain near thermal springs until sufficient strength returns. Ambiguous timeline, yet practical advice given his condition. 3 days had passed since that meeting. The infection had receded substantially through combination of proper medication and improved circumstances. Regular meals from supplies left at nearby shelter, constructed specifically for his use. Warmer ambient temperature near geothermal activity, reduced physical demands allowing biological resources to focus on healing rather than survival maintenance. The mysterious benefactor appeared occasionally, brief encounters at dawn or dusk, bringing additional supplies, checking wound healing progress with professional efficiency, suggesting medical training, departing before conversation could extend beyond essential information exchange. Identity remained unconfirmed, though evidence suggested indigenous heritage connected to regional tribes, Blackfoot perhaps, or Crow, based on linguistic elements occasionally incorporated into limited verbal communication. John had stopped pressing for explanation after first day, accepting assistance with gratitude transcending curiosity. Questions would find answers in appropriate timing or remain mysteries contributing to experience without diminishing its value. His grandmother would have approved this perspective shift, wisdom recognizing boundaries between knowable and unknowable without diminishing either category's significance. The small green shoot beneath melting snow represented something beyond itself. Seasonal cycle continuing despite apparent interruption, life persisting through seemingly impossible conditions, renewal emerging precisely when needed rather than when expected. John touched it gently now, confirmation of material reality rather than fever-induced hallucination. First spring visitor, he murmured, speaking aloud despite solitude. Habit developed through weeks of isolation, where verbalization maintained connection to human identity otherwise threatened by wilderness immersion. His strength had returned incrementally, noticeable improvement each day, through combination of proper nutrition, medication, adequate rest, and proximity to thermal warmth that reduced environmental demands on weakened physiology. Still far from optimal condition, but trajectory established toward recovery rather than decline. The shelter provided by his benefactor demonstrated knowledge beyond conventional wilderness skills, positioned perfectly to capture thermal benefits without rockfall risk, constructed from materials suggesting long-term regional habitation rather than temporary expedition, interior designed for healing specifically rather than general habitation. John moved carefully to rock outcropping, overlooking largest hot spring, lowering himself to sitting position to observe landscape transformed through recent weather shift. Temperature had moderated significantly, still below freezing, but perhaps -5 rather than -25. Snowpack showed initial compression, indicating melt process beginning despite calendar, suggesting winter should maintain dominance for weeks still. Wildlife had begun emerging from survival patterns, tracks indicating deer approaching thermal area during night hours, smaller mammals leaving evidence of foraging activities in exposed vegetation areas, bird species beyond ravens making occasional appearances against still gray sky. Ecosystem responding to subtle shifts with collective intelligence that operated beneath conscious calculation. The chess pieces remained positioned as he'd left them in emergency shelter, King defended by remaining resources against opponent's overwhelming advantage. John found himself wondering if that game remained in progress or had been rendered irrelevant through intervention that altered fundamental parameters beyond strategic considerations. His attention shifted to movement at Forest Edge, the mysterious benefactor approaching with unhurried confidence across terrain that would have challenged less experienced traveler. Not the fluid grace previously displayed when John's perception had been fever-influenced, but practical efficiency born from lifetime navigating regional wilderness through seasonal extremes. "Your strength improves," the man stated upon reaching conversational distance, observation rather than question, assessment delivered with clinical detachment, suggesting professional rather than personal interest. "Thanks to your intervention," John acknowledged, gratitude genuine despite lingering questions regarding purpose and presence in location where human habitation defied logical explanation. The man nodded once, acknowledgement without elaboration. His attention shifted to distant peaks visible through thinning clouds, expression suggesting communion with landscape transcending aesthetic appreciation toward relationship approaching kinship. After prolonged silence that felt communicative rather than empty, he returned focus to immediate circumstances. "Storm cycle breaks," he stated with certainty, transcending meteorological prediction toward knowledge, embedded in environmental relationship developed through generation. 4 days remain before return. John absorbed implications, weather window opening, opportunity for evacuation or relocation, timeline provided with precision suggesting factors beyond observation available to conventional wilderness assessment. The mathematics of survival shifted accordingly. New variables introduced to equation previously weighted toward failure despite resistance. "Return where?" he asked, question encompassing multiple dimensions beyond geographical consideration. "Where needed," came reply, simultaneously frustrating in ambiguity, yet resonant with truth that transcended specific location. "Your shelter remains standing. Cabin requires significant repair before habitable." Information suggesting observation beyond explained parameters. Knowledge of both emergency shelter and original cabin. Assessment of structural conditions requiring direct observation during period when John's presence had been exclusively at alternative location. Questions multiplied rather than diminished through interaction defying conventional explanation. The small green shoot beside melting snow caught afternoon sunlight, chlorophyll activation visible as deeper emerald emergence against white background, still dominating landscape beyond thermal influence. Life responding to opportunity with immediacy transcending calculated hesitation, expansion rather than contraction, when conditions permitted growth previously impossible under environmental constraints. John watched it with renewed attention, recognition deepening beyond botanical identification toward metaphorical significance that might once have seemed inappropriately philosophical for practical wilderness situations. Perspective shift, acknowledging wisdom dimensions operating beneath scientific materialism without negating either approach to understanding reality, presenting itself with undeniable clarity, despite previous perceptual limitation. The radio crackled to life beneath John's careful adjustments, static gradually resolving into human voice, first external communication beyond his mysterious benefactor in nearly 5 weeks of isolation. He'd found the device partially disassembled in his shelter upon return. Components cleaned and reconnected with precision, suggesting electronic expertise beyond his own capabilities. "Repeat, this is Rocky Mountain Ranger Station Alpha, calling identified emergency beacon. Please respond if receiving." John pressed the transmit button, voice steadier than expected, given circumstances. "Ranger Station Alpha, this is John Everett responding to your call. Receiving you with moderate clarity. Oh." The silence stretched several seconds before response burst through static. "John Everett, verification requested. Provide Ranger service number and last assignment location. Security protocol, standard procedure, when communication originated from uncertain sources." John supplied requested information with practiced efficiency, including additional details only Ranger personnel would possess. The silence following his transmission contained different quality, surprise rather than procedural pause. "John, "Why, thought you were..." Recovery teams reported no survivors at your location after the storm hit. "Where have you been for the past month?" The question encompassed complexities difficult to address through patchy radio communication. John provided simplified response, focusing on practical elements: emergency shelter relocation, injury and infection, eventual discovery of hot springs, providing environmental advantage against lethal conditions. He omitted elements defying conventional explanation: mysterious assistance, coordinated wolf behavior, indigenous guide with knowledge transcending normal wilderness expertise, current status and position. The voice had shifted from shock to professional assessment. Stable condition, mobility restored, supplies adequate for approximately 2 weeks. Currently located at emergency shelter coordinates Sierra Echo 7. The conversation proceeded through technical exchange, weather projections, evacuation possibilities, supply drop scheduling. John provided necessary information while watching sky through small window where clouds had thinned to occasional patches against deepening blue. Temperature had risen above freezing for first time since ordeal began. Snow transforming from powder to heavier consistency, indicating accelerating melt cycle. The radio had been repaired, but not by his hand. Like many elements of recent experience, explanation resided outside conventional understanding, yet result remained undeniably present within observable reality. John had stopped questioning such occurrences, accepting them as aspects of existence previously overlooked through perceptual limitations, rather than manifestations requiring supernatural categorization. Transmission concluded with confirmation of supply helicopter, scheduled following morning, weather permitting, evacuation offered, but not mandated given his stabilized condition, and expressed preference to remain until shelter decommissioning could be properly completed. The Ranger Service respected experienced personnel's field decisions when circumstances justified autonomous operation. John secured the radio carefully, moving to exit shelter into afternoon sunlight that carried actual warmth against exposed skin for first time in memory that seemed increasingly distant from current reality. The transformation had accelerated beyond meteorological predictions, spring arriving weeks earlier than historical patterns suggested possible, as if natural systems had collectively decided to terminate winter's dominion through shared intention rather than predictable seasonal progression. The mysterious benefactor had not appeared since John's return to emergency shelter 4 days earlier, though evidence of his presence remained. Reorganized supplies, structural reinforcements against snowmelt flooding, medicinal preparations with instructions in precise handwriting combining scientific terminology with traditional knowledge, indicators. Support continued without physical manifestation, practical assistance without interpersonal engagement. John surveyed surroundings with Ranger's objective assessment. Snowpack reduced by approximately 40% since temperature moderation began. Drainage channels emerging through strategic melt patterns. Wildlife tracks, indicating species emergence from winter survival patterns toward normal territorial behaviors. The mathematics of survival had shifted fundamentally, equation now weighted heavily toward success rather than resistance against inevitable failure. The wolf pack had withdrawn to higher elevation, as prey species became more accessible in traditional hunting grounds, though occasional distant howls suggested continued awareness of human presence. They'd observed with such unsettling intelligence during storm's peak intensity. Another relationship transformed through circumstance, rather than terminated through absence. His original cabin remained inaccessible without significant effort, though aerial assessment would be possible following day when helicopter approached. Rebuilding would require substantial resources and energy investment. Decision point approaching, regarding whether such effort represented appropriate future trajectory or attachment to past circumstances rendered obsolete through recent experience. The carved chess pieces had been gathered carefully upon shelter return, king and companions wrapped in protective cloth and secured in pack now resting against exterior wall. The game they represented had concluded without formal resolution, neither victory nor defeat, but transformation into different engagement operating under rules, transcending strategic competition toward collaborative navigation through conditions affecting all participants regardless of perceived opposition. John touched the eagle feather, secured in breast pocket, talisman connecting physical realm with something operating beneath observable reality, yet undeniably present within experience, increasingly difficult to articulate through conventional vocabulary. His grandmother would have understood without explanation, perception shaped through cultural framework. Accommodating dimensions modern scientific materialism struggled to incorporate despite mounting evidence, suggesting incomplete paradigm rather than superior methodology. The radio represented connection to civilized world he'd departed physically, but maintained identity association with through professional training and lifetime habit. Its repair symbolized reopened communication channel between separate but overlapping realities, rather than simple technological restoration. John appreciated both dimensions simultaneously, practical function and metaphorical significance, operating as complementary aspects rather than competing interpretations. Spring had arrived with sudden certainty, transformation accelerating beyond incremental progression toward fundamental state change throughout environmental systems. John observed these shifts with attention developed through lifetime wilderness immersion, but recently enhanced through perspective expansion, incorporating dimensions previously excluded from conscious consideration. The mountains remained physically unchanged yet somehow different, not through alteration of material composition, but through relationship transformation as his perception incorporated aspects previously filtered through limiting framework. Not mystical revelation, but practical expansion, recognizing complexity previously reduced through artificial categorization rather than experienced through direct engagement. His plans developed organically rather than through imposed structure. Immediate tasks, focusing on proper shelter decommissioning, medium-term considerations including cabin assessment and potential rehabilitation. Longer trajectory, incorporating elements previously excluded from life framework through habitual limitation rather than conscious choice. Each dimension unfolding with natural progression rather than forced implementation. John moved carefully around shelter exterior, assessing structural integrity against environmental transition currently underway. The radio's repair had changed mathematical variables in survival equation, yet somehow seemed less significant than small green shoot, now visible near shelter entrance. Additional Indian paintbrush emerging through diminishing snow with quiet persistence, transcending dramatic manifestation, life continuing with or without technological intervention, natural systems operating through intelligence distributed throughout ecosystem rather than centralized through human dominance hierarchy. Humbling recognition without diminishing human capacity for contribution toward collaborative existence within environmental contexts that ultimately determined viable parameters through physical laws operating beyond preference or ideology. The handwritten letter lay completed on the small table, pages filled with careful script that reflected deliberate thought rather than hasty composition. John read through it once more before folding the sheets precisely, inserting them into envelope addressed to Rebecca Everett at her last known location. No certainty it would reach her after years of separation, but attempt represented necessary completion regardless of outcome. Dear Rebecca, if this reaches you, I hope it finds you well. There's no adequate explanation for my absence from your life these past years that wouldn't sound like excuse rather than reason. Perhaps understanding isn't possible or even necessary anymore. What matters is acknowledging that leaving was my failure, not yours. The helicopter had departed hours earlier, carrying supplies that would sustain him through transition period, while decisions regarding future direction crystallized organically rather than through forced timeline. The Ranger Service had expressed surprise at his choice to remain temporarily rather than evacuate immediately, concern evident in their communication, but respect for his experience ultimately overriding institutional protocol. The letter continued through pages addressing what truly mattered: acknowledgement of mistakes, recognition of her perspective's validity, appreciation for qualities inherited from her mother, hope for her happiness, without expectation of forgiveness or reconciliation. Not atonement, but honest communication without agenda beyond truth expression. Beyond shelter walls, spring advanced with authority that transcended seasonal expectation. Temperature consistently above freezing, snowpack diminishing through accelerated melt cycle, wildlife emerging from winter patterns with increasing frequency. The mathematics of survival had fundamentally altered, equation now balanced toward prosperity rather than mere persistence. His original cabin would require substantial renovation before habitable again. Helicopter flyover confirming structural damage beyond simple repair. Decision regarding rehabilitation versus relocation remained pending. Options considered without artificial urgency despite practical considerations requiring eventual resolution. John secured the letter in waterproof container, alongside official report, detailing experience in scientific terminology appropriate for Ranger Service records. The document represented parallel truth, factually accurate, while necessarily incomplete regarding elements defying conventional categorization within institutional framework. Some experiences remained valid, despite resistance to documentation through existing paradigmatic constraints. He gathered essential supplies for short excursion journey to nearby ridge offering optimal visibility across valleys transformed through environmental transition currently underway. The pack felt surprisingly light against shoulders, strengthened through recovery process that had accelerated beyond medical expectation. Like surrounding ecosystem, his physical rehabilitation had progressed with unexpected efficiency once fundamental conditions shifted from resistance toward facilitation. The mysterious benefactor had not reappeared since final meeting near Hot Spring, though evidence of continued presence manifested through subtle indications, pathways cleared without visible human intervention, periodic supply arrangements suggesting intimate knowledge of needs without direct communication. Occasional eagle feather, positioned at significant location without apparent placement mechanism. "You're welcome to show yourself, John," addressed the seemingly empty landscape as he secured shelter door. "Though I respect your preference for no response beyond wind's movement through pine boughs and distant hawk cry echoing across valley. Communication continuing through means transcending conventional interaction rather than terminating through absence of direct engagement. Relationship established during crisis, maintaining integrity despite circumstance transformation. The journey to Ridgeline proceeded without difficulty. Terrain navigable through combination of experience and improved conditions, body responding efficiently to physical demands despite recent ordeal. John paused occasionally to document emerging vegetation with scientific precision. Spring flowers appearing with abundance, suggesting accelerated seasonal progression. Ecological systems demonstrating resilience, transcending temporary disruption through extreme weather patterns. From summit